It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in the upscale neighborhood of Pine Grove Estates. The sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns and elegant homes that lined Maple Avenue. Officer Mike Davidson adjusted his sunglasses while his partner, Steve Turner, slowly drove their patrol car through the quiet streets. The two officers had been partners for 3 years at the Pine Grove Police Department. Davidson, a 12-year veteran with a reputation for being overzealous, often led their interactions with the public. Turner, newer to the force, usually followed his senior partner's lead without question. They noticed a young black teenager walking on the sidewalk, wearing basketball shorts and a hoodie despite the warm weather. The boy carried a backpack and moved with purpose, clearly heading somewhere specific. Davidson immediately straightened in his seat. "That kid doesn't look like he belongs here," Davidson muttered to his partner. "Let's check him out." Turner nodded and pulled the patrol car to the curb ahead of the teenager. The boy, Marcus Johnson, was listening to music through his earbuds, lost in thought about the basketball practice he just finished at the community center. At 17, he was one of the top players on his high school team and had several college scouts watching his progress. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, hands resting near their weapons. Davidson's voice boomed across the quiet street. "Hey you, stop right there." Marcus removed his earbuds and stopped walking, his heart beginning to race. He'd been raised to know exactly how to handle police encounters, but that didn't make them any less frightening. Several residents peered through their windows at the commotion. "Hands where we can see them," Turner commanded, moving to flank Marcus on the left while Davidson approached from the front. Marcus slowly raised his hands, keeping them visible. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked calmly, remembering his father's lessons about staying composed during police interactions. Davidson's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Where are you coming from, and where are you headed?" "I'm walking home, sir. I just finished basketball practice at the community center," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Home?" Davidson scoffed. "You live around here?" His tone made it clear he didn't believe Marcus. "Yes, sir. I live at 1242 Maple Avenue, just 3 houses down," Marcus explained, noting how both officers exchanged skeptical glances. "Let's see some ID," Turner demanded, moving closer. Marcus slowly reached for his back pocket, narrating his movements. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back right pocket, officers." He produced his student ID from Pine Grove High School. Davidson snatched the ID card and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "This only shows you go to school here. Doesn't prove you live in this neighborhood." "Take off that backpack," Turner ordered. "Empty it out on the ground." Marcus felt his face flush with humiliation as neighbors gathered on their porches to watch. He carefully removed his backpack and began removing its contents: basketball shoes, gym clothes, school books, and his water bottle. "Spread it all out where we can see everything," Davidson commanded, using his foot to scatter Marcus's belongings across the sidewalk. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor who had known Marcus since he was a child, stepped onto her porch. "Officers, there must be some mistake. That young man—" "Ma'am, please stay back and let us do our job," Turner cut her off sharply. Marcus pulled out his phone, keeping it visible. "Officers, I'm going to record this interaction for both our safety." His hand trembled slightly as he pressed record, but his voice remained steady. Davidson's face hardened. "Put that phone away before I consider it a threat." "With all due respect, sir, I have the right to record this encounter," Marcus replied, remembering the civil rights lessons his father had drilled into him since childhood. The situation was escalating quickly. Marcus could see more neighbors gathering, some with their own phones out, recording the scene. His heart pounded in his chest, but he maintained his composure, knowing that one wrong move could have serious consequences. Little did the officers know that their next few minutes would completely change the trajectory of their careers, and their understanding of racial profiling would be challenged in the most unexpected way possible. The tension on Maple Avenue continued to build as officers Davidson and Turner persisted in their aggressive questioning of Marcus. His belongings remained scattered across the sidewalk, and a small crowd of concerned neighbors had gathered at a distance. "Where did you get these expensive basketball shoes?" Davidson demanded, picking up Marcus's Nike sneakers. "These look brand new." They were a birthday gift from my father, sir, Marcus replied, maintaining his composure despite the humiliation he felt. His phone continued recording the encounter, much to Davidson's visible annoyance. Mrs. Thompson, still watching from her porch, couldn't stay quiet any longer. Officers, I'd known this young man since he was in elementary school. His father is. Ma'am, this is your final warning to stay back, Turner interrupted sharply. This is a police matter. Davidson circled Marcus like a predator, his boots crunching over scattered notebook papers. So you're telling me you live in one of these million-dollar homes? You expect us to believe that? Marcus took a deep breath before responding. Yes, sir. As I mentioned, I live at 1242 Maple Avenue. You can verify. Don't get smart with me, kid, Davidson snapped, stepping closer to Marcus. We've had reports of break-ins in this area. How do we know you're not casing these houses? More neighbors had emerged from their homes, many with phones raised. Some were making calls, their voices urgent but hushed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene, and passing cars slowed to observe the confrontation. Officer, I'd like to call my father, Marcus said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. He can confirm everything I'm telling you. Turner laughed dismissively. Oh, now you want to call Daddy? Sure, go ahead. Let's see who answers. As Marcus began to reach for his phone, Davidson's hand moved to his weapon. Keep those hands where I can see them. You don't make any moves unless we tell you to. Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and he knew it. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Davidson ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. We're going to sort this out at the station. Officers, please, Marcus said, his voice finally showing signs of stress. This is a mistake. I live here. I'm just trying to get home from basketball practice. Several cars had now stopped completely, their drivers watching the scene unfold. Among them was Sarah Chen, a local news reporter who had been driving home from work. She quietly began filming with her professional camera from her car. I said, turn around. Davidson's voice echoed through the neighborhood. This is your last warning. Marcus slowly began to turn, fighting to keep his breathing steady. His father's words echoed in his mind. Stay calm, comply safely, and live to fight the injustice later. Turner moved to assist with the handcuffing when suddenly a voice cut through the tension like a knife. What exactly is going on here? All heads turned toward the sound. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb, its engine still running. The driver's door opened, and a tall, distinguished-looking man in a police chief's uniform stepped out. The color drained from both officers' faces as they recognized the figure approaching them. Chief Robert Johnson's face was a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the scene, his son's belongings scattered across the ground, the gathering crowd of neighbors, and his own officers preparing to handcuff his teenage son. Davidson's hands fell away from his handcuffs. Turner took an involuntary step backward. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as their boss walked toward them, his shoes clicking against the pavement with each deliberate step. The next few moments would change everything, not just for these officers, but for the entire Pine Grove Police Department. The consequences of their actions were about to become painfully clear, and their assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood were about to be shattered completely. Chief Robert Johnson's presence brought an immediate stillness to Maple Avenue. The crowd of neighbors fell silent, and even the birds seemed to pause their evening songs. His face remained professionally composed, but his eyes burned with controlled anger as he took in the scene before him. Marcus, he called out to his son, his voice steady and authoritative. Are you all right? Yes, Dad, Marcus replied, lowering his hands slowly. I was just trying to explain to the officers that I live here. Chief Johnson nodded once, then turned his attention to his officers. Davidson and Turner stood frozen, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. The chief's next words cut through the air like ice. Officers Davidson and Turner, step away from my son immediately. The two officers moved back quickly, their faces showing a mix of shock and growing horror. Davidson's usual swagger had disappeared completely, replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Turner's hand, which had been resting on his weapon, dropped limply to his side. Chief Johnson, we were just responding to. Davidson began, but the chief raised his hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Before you continue, Officer Davidson, I want you to look around, Chief Johnson said, his voice carrying across the now silent street. Look at what you've done to my son's belongings. Look at the neighbors you've alarmed. Look at the phones recording this incident. Sarah Chen, the news reporter, had emerged from her car and was now openly filming with her professional camera. Mrs. Thompson stood on her porch with tears in her eyes, while other neighbors watched with expressions ranging from anger to shame. Marcus, the chief addressed his son again, please show me the video you recorded. Marcus handed his phone to his father, who watched the footage with increasing gravity. The sound of his son calmly stating his rights, followed by the officer's aggressive responses, played clearly for everyone to hear. Sir, we had no idea he was your son, Turner attempted to explain, his voice shaking slightly. Chief Johnson's response was immediate and sharp. And that makes this acceptable. Would this treatment be justified if he were anyone else's son? Is this how you've been trained to serve our community? Both officers stared at the ground, unable to meet their superior's gaze. The chief continued, his voice now addressing the gathering crowd as much as his officers. I've spent 25 years in law enforcement, working to build trust between our department and this community. I've implemented training programs, community outreach initiatives, and strict protocols for citizen interactions. He paused, looking directly at his officers. And yet, here we are, watching my own son being profiled in front of his home. Marcus began picking up his scattered belongings, and several neighbors moved to help him. Mrs. Thompson handed him his water bottle, patting his shoulder gently. Both of you, badges and weapons, Chief Johnson commanded. You're on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Davidson's face reddened. Chief, please, we were just doing our jobs. Your job, Chief Johnson interrupted, is to protect and serve AL members of this community with respect and dignity. What I saw today was neither protection nor service. It was harassment, plain and simple. As the officers surrendered their badges and weapons, the chief turned to Sarah Chen, who was still recording. Ms. Chen, I believe you caught all of this. Good. The Pine Grove Police Department will be holding a press conference tomorrow morning. This incident will not be swept under the rug. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across Maple Avenue. The neighbors began to disperse, many stopping to express their support to Marcus and the chief. The two officers stood in silence, their careers and reputations hanging by a thread. This incident would become a turning point for the Pine Grove Police Department, but for now, Chief Johnson had one priority. He turned to his son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Let's go home, son. Your mother will want to know you're safe. The following morning arrived with a storm of activity at the Pine Grove Police Department. By 8 a.m., news vans lined the street outside the building, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside his office, Chief Robert Johnson reviewed the footage from the incident for the 10th time, each viewing stoking his determination for change. Marcus sat across from his father's desk, wearing a pressed shirt and tie for the upcoming press conference. Though still shaken from yesterday's events, he carried himself with the same dignity he'd shown during the confrontation. Are you sure you want to speak at the conference? Chief Johnson asked his son, concern evident in his voice. No one would blame you for sitting this one out. Marcus straightened in his chair. Dad, you've always taught me to stand up for what's right. If my voice can help prevent this from happening to someone else, I need to speak. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, head of Internal Affairs, entered with a thick folder in her hands. Her expression was grim as she placed it on the chief's desk. Sir, I've completed the preliminary review of Officers Davidson and Turner's record, she reported. We found a disturbing pattern of similar incidents. Multiple complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and unauthorized stops. Most of them previously buried or dismissed. Chief Johnson's jaw tightened as he flipped through the documents. How did these slip through our system? The officers were careful, Martinez explained. They usually targeted individuals who were less likely to file formal complaints, or they intimidated them into dropping charges. But the pattern is clear now that we're looking closely. Marcus leaned forward, studying a page of statistics. Dad, look at these numbers. Their stop and search rates for minorities are 3 times higher than other officers. Before they could discuss further, another knock came at the door. Mrs. Thompson, their elderly neighbor from yesterday, entered with her daughter, a civil rights attorney. Chief Johnson, Mrs. Thompson said, "I hope we're not interrupting, but Amanda and I wanted to speak with you before the press conference." Amanda Thompson stepped forward, her legal briefcase in hand. "Chief, my mother showed me her footage from yesterday, and I've seen the other videos circulating online. This isn't just about 2 officers. This is a symptom of a larger problem." "I agree," Chief Johnson nodded, "and I want your help to address it." The next hour was spent in intense discussion. Amanda outlined potential reforms while Marcus shared his perspective as both the victim of profiling and the son of a police chief. Lieutenant Martinez took detailed notes, occasionally adding insights from her internal investigations. As the clock approached 10 a.m., the chief's secretary announced that the press room was full. Reporters from local and national networks waited expectantly, their cameras ready to broadcast this story across the country. Chief Johnson stood, adjusting his uniform. "Marcus, are you ready?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, standing tall beside his father. As they walked toward the press room, they passed Officers Davidson and Turner, who sat sullenly in the waiting area with their union representatives. The officers couldn't meet Marcus's eyes, their faces showing a mix of shame and defiance. Just before entering the press room, Chief Johnson turned to the group. "What happened yesterday was a wake-up call. Today, we start making real changes in this department. Not just policy changes on paper, but fundamental changes in how we train, supervise, and hold our officers accountable." Marcus smiled at his father, proud of his determination to turn this painful incident into positive change. As they opened the doors to face the press, camera flashes erupted like lightning. The time had come to share their story and begin the hard work of reform. Behind them, Mrs. Thompson whispered to her daughter, "Sometimes it takes seeing something happen to the right person before everyone else's pain becomes visible too." The next few hours would set the stage for months of transformation in Pine Grove, starting with this moment of truth before the cameras. The police department's press room buzzed with energy as cameras flashed and reporters adjusted their microphones. Chief Johnson stood at the podium, with Marcus seated to his right alongside Amanda Thompson and Lieutenant Martinez. The room fell silent as the chief began to speak. "Yesterday afternoon, in our community of Pine Grove, 2 of our officers stopped a young man walking home from basketball practice. They questioned him aggressively, scattered his belongings, and nearly arrested him, all without probable cause. That young man was my son, Marcus Johnson." The room erupted with questions, but Chief Johnson raised his hand for silence. "What happened to my son isn't unique. What's unique is that it happened to someone whose father could immediately stop it. How many other young men and women have faced similar treatment without having a police chief for a parent?" Sarah Chen, the reporter who had witnessed the incident, stood up. "Chief Johnson, what disciplinary actions are being taken against Officers Davidson and Turner?" "Both officers have been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full investigation," he responded. "But this goes beyond 2 officers. We're implementing immediate department-wide changes." Marcus approached the podium when his father gestured to him. His voice was clear and steady as he addressed the crowd. "I've been taught since childhood how to handle police encounters. Stay calm, speak clearly, know your rights, and record everything. Yesterday, I did everything right, but I was still treated like a criminal in front of my own home." The reporters scribbled frantically as Marcus continued. "I'm lucky. I'm the chief's son. But what about my teammates? My classmates? How many of them have similar stories with different endings?" Amanda Thompson stepped forward next, laying out the legal framework for the department's reform plan. "We're establishing an independent civilian oversight committee, mandatory monthly bias training, and a new system for tracking and investigating complaints against officers." In the back of the room, Officers Davidson and Turner sat with their union representatives, watching their careers unravel. Davidson's face had lost its usual arrogance, replaced by a look of genuine shock as he heard Marcus speak about the incident's impact. Lieutenant Martinez presented the findings from her preliminary investigation. "Our review has uncovered concerning patterns in these officers' past conduct. were reopening several previously dismissed complaints and reaching out to affected community members. Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from the side, stood to share her perspective as a longtime resident. I've lived on Maple Avenue for 40 years. Yesterday, I watched officers harass a boy I've known since he was in diapers. If they treat the police chief's son this way, how are they treating others? The questions continued for another hour. Chief Johnson addressed each one directly, refusing to downplay the severity of the situation or make excuses for his department's failures. As the press conference drew to a close, Marcus made a final statement that silenced the room. Yesterday, those officers didn't see the police chief's son. They didn't see a high school basketball player with college scouts watching him. They didn't see a young man who volunteers at the community center. They just saw a black teenager in an expensive neighborhood. That bias could have cost me my future, or worse. How many others weren't as fortunate as I was? After the press conference, in the hallway, Officer Turner approached Marcus with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never thought about it this way before." Marcus looked at him steadily. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Chief Johnson watched this exchange, seeing the first small sign that real change might be possible. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but today had been a start. As they left the building, reporters called out more questions, but the chief simply stated, "Actions speak louder than words. Watch what we do next." The afternoon sun highlighted the gathering crowd outside, community members holding signs demanding change, young people sharing their own stories, and officers from the department standing in contemplative silence. The transformation of Pine Grove's police force was just beginning. 1 month after the incident, the Pine Grove Police Department looked markedly different. Chief Johnson's office had become a hub of activity, with community leaders, civil rights advocates, and police reform experts coming and going throughout each day. This particular morning, Marcus sat in on a training session, watching as Officers Davidson and Turner faced their fellow officers. The two men had spent the past month on unpaid leave, completing intensive bias training and community service. Now they stood before their colleagues, sharing their story as a cautionary tale. "I've been a cop for 12 years, Davidson began, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "I thought I was one of the good ones. But watching that video of myself with Marcus, I didn't recognize the person I'd become." Turner nodded, adding, "We kept telling ourselves we were just being vigilant, doing our jobs, but the data doesn't lie. When Lieutenant Martinez showed us our stop records broken down by race, I couldn't deny it anymore." Around the room, other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many had similar patterns in their own records, though perhaps not as extreme. The department's new transparency initiatives have brought uncomfortable truths to light. Marcus stood up to address the room. "A lot of you have known me since I was little, coming to bring my dad lunch or stopping by the station after school. But that day, Officers Davidson and Turner didn't see Chief Johnson's son. They saw a threat that didn't exist." In the back of the room, Amanda Thompson was reviewing body camera footage with a team of trainers. The department had implemented new protocols requiring officers to announce and justify every stop they made, with regular reviews of the footage. Mrs. Thompson had become a regular presence at the station, leading community engagement sessions where residents could share their experiences with officers in a structured, respectful environment. Today, she watched proudly as her grandson, a college student, described his own encounters with law enforcement. Chief Johnson entered the room, carrying a stack of new departmental policies. "The changes we're implementing aren't just about following rules," he announced. "They're about changing the culture of policing itself." The new policies included requirements for officers to live within the communities they patrolled, regular rotation of patrol assignments to prevent territorial behaviors, and mandatory participation in community events outside of their law enforcement roles. Davidson raised his hand. "Chief, I've been thinking about something Marcus said during our training, about how we never really knew the people we were stopping. I'd like to volunteer to coach of the community center's basketball program." Several other officers followed with their own proposals for community engagement. The mood in the room had shifted from defensive to proactive, with many officers eager to rebuild trust with the community they served. Lieutenant Martinez presented the latest statistics. Stops and searches had decreased significantly, while positive community interactions had increased. Crime rates remained stable, challenging the assumption that aggressive policing was necessary for public safety. As the session wrapped up, Marcus pulled Davidson and Turner aside. "My team has a game this Friday. You should come watch, not as officers, but as members of this community." Both men nodded, understanding the significance of the invitation. Turner spoke up, "We'd like that," and Marcus, "Thank you for helping us learn from our mistakes instead of just condemning us for them." Chief Johnson watched this exchange from his office doorway, feeling cautiously optimistic. The department still had a long way to go, but real change was happening. The incident that could have torn the community apart was instead bringing it together in unexpected ways. As officers filed out of the training room, many stopped to chat with community members who had attended the session. The rigid barrier between police and public was beginning to dissolve, replaced by genuine dialogue and understanding. Outside the station, a new sign had been installed: "To protect and serve all members of our community." It wasn't just words anymore, it was becoming reality. 3 months after the incident, Pine Grove High School's gymnasium was packed for the championship basketball game. Marcus Johnson dribbled down the court, his teammates spreading out in their practice formation. In the stands, an unusual sight caught the crowd's attention. Officers Davidson and Turner sat with a group of kids from the community center's youth program, where they now volunteered regularly. Both men wore casual clothes instead of uniforms, cheering alongside parents and students. Their transformation from feared figures to community mentors had become a symbol of Pine Grove's changing police culture. Chief Johnson watched from the bleachers as his son made a perfect pass to his teammate. Next to him sat Sarah Chen, who had continued following the department's reform story. She was working on a documentary about the changes in Pine Grove, featuring interviews with officers and community members. "Your son's story has inspired other departments across the state," she commented, taking notes as Marcus scored another basket. "3 other cities have adopted your reform program." On the court, Marcus played with focused intensity. The scouts from major universities watched from their reserved seats, but he wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the kids in the stands who used to fear the police, but now had officers cheering them on at their games. During halftime, Davidson approached Chief Johnson. "Sir, I wanted you to know, we had a situation yesterday, a young man matching a suspect description. Before everything, I would have stopped him immediately. Instead, we took time to observe, gather information, and communicate. Turns out he was just a college student heading to study group." The chief nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of judgment we're trying to develop." "How did it feel, making that choice?" "Better," Davidson replied honestly. "Much better than living with the guilt of what we did to Marcus." The game resumed, with Pine Grove High pulling ahead in the final quarter. Mrs. Thompson, still active in the department's Community Oversight Committee, led a group of elderly residents in enthusiastic cheering. The sight of police officers and community members sitting together, sharing snacks and conversation, would have been unimaginable just months ago. Turner had started a mentorship program, pairing officers with local teenagers for basketball training and life guidance. Today, several of his mentees watched the game while wearing t-shirts with the program's motto, "Building Trust, One Game at a Time." As the final minutes ticked down, Marcus stole the ball and raced toward the basket. The crowd rose to their feet as he leaped for a decisive dunk, securing Pine Grove's victory. The gymnasium erupted in celebration. In the chaos of the victory celebration, something remarkable happened. Young black and brown kids rushed to hug not just Marcus, but also Davidson and Turner. The officers, who once inspired fear, were now receiving high fives and excited chatter about the game. Lieutenant Martinez, recording statistics for the department's monthly transparency report, noted how the officers naturally integrated with the crowd. No tension, no suspicion, just shared joy in a community victory. After the game, as families filtered out of the gymnasium, Marcus approached his former antagonists. "Coach Davidson, Coach Turner, what did you think of that last play?" The simple question carried deeper meaning. These men, who had once thrown his belongings across a sidewalk, were now trusted mentors in his community. Their weekly basketball sessions had become a space for honest conversations about race, power, and responsibility. Chief Johnson watched this interaction with pride. The incident that could have ended careers and deepened community divisions had instead sparked genuine transformation. As he prepared to head home, several parents stopped him to share positive interactions they'd had with officers recently. Outside the gymnasium, under the evening sky, Pine Grove felt different. Police cars drove by with windows down, officers waving to residents who waved back. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion had been replaced by something new, not perfect trust, but a genuine commitment to understanding and growth. Marcus's story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was now a blueprint for change, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal when addressed with honesty, accountability, and a willingness to transform. 1 year after the incident on Maple Avenue, Pine Grove had become a model for police reform across the country. The police department's training center, now named the Community Trust Initiative, hosted officers from other cities eager to learn from their transformation. Marcus Johnson, now a freshman at Georgetown University studying law, returned home for summer break to find his neighborhood dramatically changed. As he walked down Maple Avenue, the same street where he'd once been harassed, he saw officers playing basketball with local kids in driveways and chatting with residents on their porches. Chief Johnson had been invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference, sharing Pine Grove's success story. The department's statistics told a compelling narrative. Complaints against officers had dropped by 85%, community engagement had increased tenfold, and crime rates had decreased through improved community trust and cooperation. Officers Davidson and Turner had become unlikely champions of reform. Their story, from being the catalysts of controversy to leaders of change, was featured in police training materials nationwide. Davidson now headed the department's community engagement division, while Turner led bias prevention training for new recruits. "It's strange," Marcus told his father as they walked through the neighborhood. "A year ago, I was terrified on this street. Now look at Officer Davidson teaching those kids how to dribble." The Community Trust Initiative had expanded beyond its original scope. Local businesses had joined the effort, offering internships and job opportunities to young people who participated in police community programs. The walls between law enforcement and residents had crumbled, replaced by genuine relationships. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her porch as always, had seen the neighborhood's transformation firsthand. "You know," she told Marcus, "last week I saw an officer stop to help Mr. Rodriguez with his groceries. No sirens, no suspicion, just one neighbor helping another." At the police station, Lieutenant Martinez presented the yearly review to a room full of journalists and community leaders. The data showed sustained improvement in every metric they tracked, but more importantly, the personal stories shared by residents revealed a fundamental shift in how they viewed and interacted with law enforcement. Sarah Chen's documentary about Pine Grove's transformation had won several awards and sparked similar initiatives in police departments across the country. She interviewed Marcus in the same spot where he'd been stopped a year ago. "What would you tell that scared teenager from a year ago?" she asked. Marcus thought for a moment. "I tell him that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. That his fear and humiliation would help create something powerful." The department had instituted permanent changes, regular community feedback sessions, transparent disciplinary procedures, and ongoing cultural competency training. But the real change was in the daily interactions between officers and residents. Turner's basketball mentorship program had expanded to include academic tutoring and career guidance. Several of his mentees were now considering careers in law enforcement, wanting to be part of the new generation of community-oriented officers. Chief Johnson, preparing for retirement, felt confident in the department's future. The reforms weren't just policies on paper, they'd become part of the department's DNA. The next generation of officers would start their careers understanding the importance of community trust and ethical policing. As the sun set on Maple Avenue, Marcus joined a pickup basketball game that included 2 officers, several teenagers, and even Mrs. Thompson's grandchildren. The sound of laughter and friendly trash talk filled the air, replacing the tension that had once characterized police community interactions. Davidson, watching from the sideline, turned to Chief Johnson. "You know, sir, that day could have ended our careers. Instead, it gave us a chance to become better officers and better people." The chief nodded, watching his son play. "Sometimes it takes seeing our worst selves to find our best selves." The story of Pine Grove's transformation had become more than a local success story. It was proof that meaningful change was possible when communities and law enforcement worked together honestly and openly. The incident that began with prejudice and fear had evolved into a legacy of understanding, growth, and lasting change. Marcus's last shot swished through the net as evening fell, and the gathered crowd cheered. On Maple Avenue, it was just another normal day in a community that had learned to trust again.